The door shattered inward with a crack that shook the walls. It didn't just open, it broke, one hinge splintering from its frame as the officer surged through, boots grinding on worn linoleum, hand already resting on the grip of his sidearm. "Down! On the floor! Now!" The command ricocheted through the modest home, louder than the old brass clock ticking by the window, louder than the hiss of a kettle left forgotten on the stove. Raymond Oates blinked. He was seated in an old armchair beside the fireplace, one hand resting on a photo of a young man in uniform, his son, now long gone. The other hand trembled slightly, curled around the receiver of a rotary phone, the cord still stretched taut across his lap. I think you've made a mistake," he said, rising slowly with effort, knees stiff with age. The officer was already moving forward, eyes locked in, scanning the room like it was hostile ground. A toppled cane, a shattered frame on the floor, a small flag folded neatly on the mantel. None of it registered. Not fully. "You were reported. Step back. Hands where I can see them." Raymond stood confused, not combative, not afraid, just confused. He looked past the uniform, toward the street through his sheer curtains. Somewhere out there, he thought he'd seen a flash of movement just before the door burst. But now, the phone in Raymond's hand crackled, the line still open, forgotten in the chaos. The officer's gaze dropped to the handset, still resting in the old man's palm, the cord tangled like a lifeline. Slowly, without a word, he reached down and took it, not to speak, just to hear. A sound, faint but sudden, emerged from the receiver. The officer froze. One hand still hovered near his belt, but something shifted in his eyes. His breath, sharp and commanding just seconds before, now caught slightly in his throat. He leaned forward, not aggressively, but drawn, like a thread had just been pulled from inside his chest. A voice came through the line. Only he could hear it. His face changed. Not fear, not confusion. Something lower. His stomach seemed to drop. The kind of visceral recoil that only comes when you realize you're standing on sacred ground you've just stepped on with muddy boots. The tension drained from his shoulders, but not the weight. That only grew. He didn't speak, didn't respond. He just looked at the old man, at the folded flag, at the medals that now glinted like silent witnesses. Outside, a boy's bike wheel creaked down the sidewalk. A breeze tugged the edge of the broken curtain, and inside, in that stillness, the young officer's jaw tightened, as if whatever he'd just heard had changed everything. The kettle began to whistle just as the sun crested the rooftops. Raymond Oates stood still in his narrow kitchen, listening not to the kettle, but to the quiet before the day's noises started creeping in. The heat rose gently from the stovetop, curling into the air with the scent of chamomile and metal. His hand trembled slightly as he turned off the burner and poured the water, steadying it with a breath, always careful not to spill. The cup, plain and chipped on one side, was older than most of his neighbors. He carried it carefully into the living room, where the light from the east window stretched like a quiet visitor across the hardwood floor. Everything in the room had a kind of pause to it, nothing in a rush. His cane tapped once as he moved past the small bookshelf, where photographs stood in their frames like standing watch, then again as he reached his seat by the mantel. There, beneath a small brass lamp, stood a flag folded perfectly into a triangle, set inside a wooden case. Next to it, a tarnished nameplate, Miles Oates, United States Marine Corps, his son, his only son. Gone now 22 years, but not a day passed that the silence didn't still carry his footsteps. Raymond reached forward, his fingers brushing dust off the glass. The air smelled faintly of dust, lemon oil, and something sweet from the garden beyond. He had tomatoes to check, and roses too. His late wife had adored them, and now they bloomed from the edge of the small backyard like centuries of remembrance. Before tending them, he took the phone from its cradle, an old rotary, beige and humming gently with a dial tone, and dialed the number he knew by heart. It rang once, then twice, then a voice, Strong despite the years, answered. "Morning, Ray," said Colonel Harris. "You're up with the birds again, I see." Raymond smiled softly. "Can't let him get ahead of me." They spoke for a few minutes. Nothing urgent. Just two voices from a time that had receded from the world's memory. They talked about the old unit, about Sergeant Bell's granddaughter graduating college, about how the paper boy never seemed to get the porch anymore. Then Harris cleared his throat, almost like a habit. "You got that school thing today, don't you?" he asked. Raymond nodded, though the colonel couldn't see it. "Kids from the middle school. They're doing interviews. Memorial Week prep. Don't let 'em call you a hero," Harris muttered. "I never let 'em." They hung up after that, with the promise of another call on Sunday. Raymond placed the receiver back on the cradle gently. He stared at it for a long moment, the curve of its shape against the wood catching the light. Outside, a pair of squirrels raced across the fence. A small flag near the mailbox leaned slightly to one side. He'd fix that later. He sipped his tea, rose slowly, and made his way to the back door. The garden welcomed him like always. The soil was warm from yesterday's sun. His knees cracked as he knelt near the tomato rows. The smell was earthy and clean. As he worked, he hummed, low and tuneless, but it steadied his hands. By the time the sun had climbed over the tall maple tree, he'd filled a small basket with tomatoes and cut back the dried leaves. Back inside, he wiped his brow and set the basket near the sink. Then came the letters, 3 of them. One from the Homeowners Association, reminding him for the 3rd time that flagpoles in the front lawn needed official clearance. One from the electric company saying his autopay hadn't processed, though he was sure it had. And one from the local library, kindly written, politely phrased, asking if he still intended to speak at the school program. He stared at the flag letter longest, not angry, not surprised, just tired. He folded them all and tucked them into a drawer beneath the hallway table. Mid-morning settled in like a warm sigh. A child's bicycle rattled past on the sidewalk. The hum of a lawnmower started across the street. Raymond brewed a second cup of tea, checked the clock, and began setting out a few items for the day. A binder of notes, a lanyard from last year's veteran event, and an old photograph of his unit, taken in 1951. He smiled when he saw it. Some of those men, gone now. Some still alive in quiet corners of the country, surviving on memory and pills and echoes. He sometimes wondered which lasted longer. It was near noon when a knock came at the door. Quick, sharp. A man in uniform, clipboard in hand. Code enforcement. "You're exceeding the setback with your rosebush, sir. It's over the sidewalk line." Raymond apologized, said he'd trim it back. The officer didn't reply, just scribbled and left. Another sigh. That was the thing about getting older, he'd once told Harris. You don't vanish overnight. You fade out of focus. One ordinance, one letter, one trimmed rose at a time. Still, he looked forward to the afternoon, to the young voices, the questions about service, about legacy, about what it felt like to come home and not be seen. He straightened his tie, brushed his jacket sleeve, and then the clock struck 3. The phone rang once, then again. He was just about to answer when a sound shattered the hour. The thunder of boots, a fist on the door, a voice barking commands through the wood. Something was wrong. Terribly, unmistakably wrong. The crash of the door reverberated through the small home like a cannon in a cathedral. Hinges shrieked. Wood splintered. The sound seemed to echo against the framed metals and book-lined walls, as if the house itself gasped in protest. Raymond Oates turned in his chair, the ceramic mug slipping from his grasp and shattering on the floor, scattering pieces like ice across the hardwood. His body stiffened, not from fear, from confusion. A sound from another world had pierced the sanctuary he'd tended for decades. Then came the voice. "Down! Now!" Boots thundered across the floor. A figure in a police uniform filled the entryway, his hand resting on his utility belt, fingers near the handle of a weapon. His brow was furrowed, jaw clenched tight, every muscle primed, as if the room held a threat only he could see. Raymond pushed himself upward, slow and stiff. The cane had rolled under the table. His knees buckled slightly as he reached out for balance. "I said down!" the officer barked again. The voice didn't match the room. It was too loud, too sharp, too certain. Raymond's hand trembled as he reached out, not toward the officer, but toward a small photograph that had fallen face down in the rush. A black and white image of a young man in a dress uniform, hand on the shoulder of a smiling boy. Miles, the day before deployment. You have the wrong... Raymond's voice broke under the weight of breath and years. Behind the officer, the front door still hung open, one hinge straining. The light outside spilled in sharply, slicing through the soft morning shadows like a blade. Outside, a neighbor's curtain flickered. Across the street, a boy froze mid-pedal, the front wheel of his bicycle turning slowly in place. The officer took another step forward, eyes darting to the fallen cane, the cracked mug, the startled man trying to make sense of the invasion into his world. His training pulled at him like a leash. Protocol, action, dominance. But something in the room felt off. Not dangerous, just wrong. Then came the sound. A low, unexpected crackle from the landline. Still connected, the receiver dangling just beyond reach on its spiral cord. The call Raymond had placed minutes earlier had not disconnected. The officer's head turned. Not sharply, but enough. His eyes landed on the phone. Something about the hum of static, the way it pulsed into the stillness, called him closer. The old man said nothing more. His breath rasped softly through his chest, the look in his eyes not afraid, but hollowed, like someone who'd been misjudged too many times to panic now. The officer reached down and lifted the phone. He held it to his ear, and in that moment, something happened. His face didn't change all at once. It fell in degrees. First, the tightness in his jaw released, then the corners of his mouth drew inward, like he'd swallowed something dry. His shoulders dropped, not in surrender, but in realization. His stomach, tight with tension just seconds before, seemed to plummet beneath his ribs. His breath caught. His eyes shifted to the folded flag on the mantel, to the medals, to the photograph on the floor. His grip on the phone loosened slightly, as if it had grown heavier in his hand. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, face pale, listening to a voice only he could hear. A voice that cracked through the noise. A voice that held weight, command, and memory. And something inside him, something shaped by order and training, began to break. From the hallway came the creak of a clock hand ticking over the hour. Outside, the boy across the street slowly dismounted his bike and stared toward the open doorway, sensing something solemn in the air. And still, the officer stood, breath shallow, phone to ear, eyes locked not on the man in front of him, but on the fragments of dignity he had nearly crushed. Officer Brent Madsen stood still, the handset pressed faintly to his ear. His face, a sculpted mask of order moments ago, now looked like a man realizing he'd walked into the middle of something sacred and cracked the glass. He didn't speak. Whatever voice was on the line had frozen his spine, rewired his breath, recalibrated his posture. Raymond Oates remained standing, barely. One hand still hovered over the corner of the table. The other gently trembled at his side. He looked not at the officer, but toward the mantel, where his son's folded flag had settled back into stillness. It was the only thing in the room untouched. The silence grew louder. Madsen finally lowered the phone. He didn't hang it up. He just returned it to the cradle gently, as if it were made of bone china. His hands moved slowly, the kind of slowness that comes when every action feels suddenly undeserved. His eyes scanned the room again, but now with different vision. The cracked mug on the floor, the photos, the medals, the bookshelf with a brass United States Army insignia etched into the side. The man he had just screamed at was not some lost civilian or threat. It was Raymond Oates, 86 years old, Bronze Star, Staff Sergeant, Cold Ridge Division. The man who, by the sound of it, still had a commanding officer who knew exactly how to use a landline, and knew how to make a man stop dead with just his voice. A weight dropped into Madsen's gut. His pulse slowed but thickened. Shame had a way of drawing the blood backward. His voice cracked. Too soft for formality, too rough for apology. He cleared his throat. Raymond did not respond. He looked down at the shards of porcelain scattered across the floor, then bent with effort to retrieve the framed photo that had fallen. The movement was slow, careful. The frame's glass was not broken, but his hands held it like it might be. Madsen took one step forward, his boots suddenly alien against the warm tones of the hardwood. "Sir," he started again. Across the street, the young boy who had been watching now stood still, helmet under his arm, watching from the sidewalk like someone observing the final act of a ceremony he didn't quite understand. Inside, Raymond straightened his back, not to confront, not to forgive, just to reclaim his center. He set the photo upright on the table. "Do you know my son, officer?" His voice wasn't sharp, just steady. Madsen blinked. "No, sir." Raymond turned his head toward the folded flag. "His name was Miles, United States Marine Corps. 3rd tour. He's been gone 8 years this fall." The officer's breath caught. "I didn't know that either, sir." The air in the room thickened again, not with tension, but with the quiet pressure of having stepped on sacred ground and finally realizing where you are. "I'm sorry," Madsen said, the words thin, inadequate, but real. "I thought—" "You didn't think," Raymond said gently. "You followed noise, not truth." It wasn't a rebuke. It was a statement of fact, delivered the way a man who'd worn uniform long enough knows the difference between orders and wisdom. Madsen's eyes stung. He turned toward the doorway, where sunlight spilled over his shadow like a spotlight on the moment he'd wish he could undo. "Is there anything I can do to make this right?" he asked, voice low. Raymond didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked past him, one slow step at a time, and reached for the door, still hanging half-broken from the frame. He pushed it closed with both hands. It groaned, but obeyed. Then with one finger, he turned the small lock into place. "There's nothing to fix," he said. "Just something to remember." From the corner table, the phone rang again. Short, urgent. Raymond answered it, holding the receiver with more steadiness now. A warm smile crept onto his lips. "Yes, Colonel. I'm all right now." He looked back over his shoulder once, just once, at the officer still standing there, smaller somehow. Then he said nothing more. The wind howled across the white ridge like a thing with memory. It was 1952, Korea, and the world was made of snow and silence and the breath of men trying not to die. Staff Sergeant Raymond Oates crouched low beside the dented hood of a stalled jeep, his gloved fingers checking the pulse of the soldier beside him. Private Bill Tennyson, 19, bleeding from the thigh, his breath too shallow. The jeep wouldn't start. The convoy had broken in the storm. 3 trucks ahead made it to base. 2 behind were gone, lost or turned back. Oates's group had taken fire before the hill. They hadn't fired back. They'd just driven faster. Now they were alone, and the cold was coming. Raymond stood slowly, the wind biting the corners of his jacket. His breath turned to frost on his collar. He squinted toward the tree line. No movement, just the thick stillness of a country too wounded to breathe. Another soldier, Corporal Lewis, sat up shakily against a crate of rations, teeth clattering in his mouth. His face was pale. "They're not coming, Sarge," he said. "We're not getting out." Raymond didn't answer. He turned toward the back of the jeep, rummaged until he found the flare case. Empty. Then a mirror, cracked but wide enough, and a small oil rag. He wrapped the mirror in the cloth, held it in both hands like it might answer something. Then he climbed onto the roof of the jeep, slowly, boots crunching into frozen steel. The wind hit harder up there, but he stood anyway. He raised the mirror toward the open sky, searching for light. Just a sliver, just enough to catch, to flash a signal to the mountain pass. The air was too cold for his hands to shake. Behind him, Tennyson groaned. "You should have left me, Sarge," he rasped. "You had the chance." Raymond's jaw tightened. He didn't look down. "That's not how we were raised," he said. "We don't leave men behind." The light shifted. A shaft of winter sun pierced through the clouds, glancing off the mirror's edge. He angled it, tilted it once, twice, then caught a beam clean. He pulsed it once, twice, a third time. A signal. Old-fashioned, maybe, but it was all they had. No answer. A gunshot cracked in the distance. Too far, too faint to threaten. Snow began to fall again, thick, heavy flakes like ash from a silent fire. Raymond climbed down, breath shallow now. He pulled the canvas coat from his own back and laid it over Tennyson's shoulders. "You'll make it," he whispered. Inside his pocket was a small black journal. He pulled it free with a stiff hand, opened it with his thumb. He wrote, "If I live long enough to grow old, I hope I'm still strong enough to stand when the world tries to knock me down." The flare, one last, fired behind the hill, and then the sound of trucks, engines, tires, voices. They were found, and he didn't speak another word the rest of that night. The next day the town stirred with stories it didn't know how to hold. Neighbors whispered. A video had made the rounds. Not long, not dramatic. Just a clip, shaky and close, of a police cruiser in front of a modest home, and a voice on the other end of a phone line halting a young officer mid-command. A caption followed. "You just stepped into the home of a Bronze Star hero, and his commanding officer just reminded you." The views climbed, but the house remained quiet. Raymond Oates spent the morning in silence, sorting through old papers, returning photographs to their places, polishing the brass frames not with haste, but with the slow, circular rhythm of someone restoring more than objects. A knock came late morning. Colonel Walter Harris stood at the doorway. Stiff back, pressed slacks, white shirt clean but collar open, no medals, no fanfare, just presence. Raymond opened the door, but didn't speak. Harris nodded once, then handed over a small tin of Darjeeling, their weekly tradition. The air between them wasn't heavy, just known. "He sounded young," Harris said finally, stepping inside. "He was," Raymond replied, "but loud." The two men sat without ceremony. No grand talk. Just the companionship of men who'd carried weight and learned the language of restraint. By noon, the phone rang again. It was the community hall. Miss Allen, the coordinator for the Memorial Week project. She spoke gently, hesitantly. "Mr. Oates, the students would still like to speak with you, if you're up to it." Raymond paused, then said, "Of course. I'll wear my jacket." By the time he and Harris arrived, the room was already full. Rows of chairs, a small podium, a folded flag in the center, not his, but part of the display. Children sat in front, cross-legged. Teachers lined the walls. Officer Madsen was there too, in civilian clothes, seated in the back row with his head down. As Raymond entered, the room did not erupt. It rose, slowly, one by one, without direction. They stood. A moment passed. Then a young girl stepped forward. 8, maybe 9. She held a paper in both hands. She looked up, nervous. "Were you scared?" she asked. Raymond smiled, soft and genuine. "Sometimes," he said. "But you keep going, sweetheart. You always keep going." The girl beamed. Then a boy stood beside her, holding something wrapped in velvet. "My dad said to give you this," he said, voice small. "He said you saved him, a long time ago. I don't know where, but he told me you'd know." Raymond took the package, unwrapping it with careful hands. Inside, a replica of a medal. Not one he'd lost, but one he'd refused years ago out of humility. He looked at it, then back at the boy. "I know where," he whispered. A long silence followed, filled not with absence but with meaning, the kind of quiet that carries weight, not emptiness. Then came the applause, not loud, not showy, but joined. Even Madsen stood and clapped, eyes lowered, face shadowed with reflection. Raymond didn't bow, didn't wave. He simply adjusted the lapel of his coat and placed the velvet box into his pocket. The recognition wasn't loud. It was right. The fallout didn't come like thunder. It came like paper settling on a desk. Officer Brent Madsen was not dismissed, not reprimanded in public, but he was reassigned to a new initiative started just days after the video surfaced. It bore the name of the man whose home he had stormed, Operation Home Honor, a program for local law enforcement and first responders. It taught how to approach a household marked by service, not with hesitation, but with care. How to recognize the quiet signs of military history, folded flags, campaign ribbons, plaques that didn't boast but bore witness. Madsen attended the first session, sat in the second row, took notes in the margins. One slide showed a black and white photo of a young man in a jeep surrounded by snow. Madsen stared at it for a long time. Later, when asked by a reporter what he had learned, Madsen simply said, "There are wars you can't see when you walk in. You listen first. You move second." Meanwhile, the town council voted unanimously to rename the cul-de-sac where Raymond lived. The plaque went up quietly, without a ceremony, just a few feet from his mailbox. Oates Way, named for Staff Sergeant Raymond Oates, who carried others through storms and stood tall when no one saw. Raymond didn't attend the unveiling. He was in his garden that morning, tying a new line to his tomato stalks. But Harris told him later, and he just nodded, faint smile at the edge of his weathered face. At the community center, a new feature was added to the Memorial Week program, a wall titled Still Standing. Each year, students would interview a veteran and write a single paragraph about what they learned. The wall grew fast. Raymond's paragraph was written by the same little girl who'd asked if he'd been scared. She wrote in crayon, "He wasn't loud. He didn't wear a cape, but he was brave every time someone tried to forget." The post office, where Raymond once carried mail for 23 years, added a bench near the loading dock with his name on it. It said only, "We remember," and so they did. It was early, too early for most, but not for Raymond Oates. The sun had barely broken the sky when he stepped outside, wearing the same cardigan he'd worn the day of his son's memorial. It was threadbare now at the elbows. He liked it that way. In one hand, a small watering can, dented, green, spotted with rust. In the other, a folded cloth. He moved through the dew-wet grass, passing the low fence where the vines had begun to climb again. The tomatoes were coming in. Not fast, but steady. Some things needed time. At the far end of the garden, beside a small stone marker tucked among the daisies, he knelt. The plaque read, "Miles Oates, United States Marine Corps." He never left anyone behind. Raymond brushed the dust from it with the cloth. His hands moved gently, not with sadness but with familiarity, the way one tends to something living, not lost. He stayed that way for a while, not praying, just being. Then, from inside the house, faintly, the phone rang. Once, twice. He didn't rush to answer. He knew the voice on the other end, knew it would wait. He looked out across the yard. A breeze stirred the trees, carrying the scent of soil and blossoms. The folded flag on the windowsill inside caught the light. A boy across the street, the same one who'd once watched from behind the curtain, now stood in the driveway, holding a small flag. He didn't wave it this time, just held it steady, eyes on the garden. Raymond saw him, nodded once, then turned back to the soil and dug a shallow line with his fingers, planted a seed, not for food, for memory. The march tune hummed low from his throat, slow, like a story retold, and the morning moved on around him, but did not pass him by. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage, sacrifice, and quiet dignity.